This is part 3 of the Modern Monetary Theory series, where we're going to review a list of variables to grade government spending beyond which political party suggested it, because that's not working anymore and we all know it. Let's start with what should be the easiest variable for everyone to agree upon, real GDP or real gross domestic product, which is the total value of goods and services produced in the United States and is found by adding C, G, I, and X, where C is total private consumer spending, G is total government spending, I is a country's investment on capital, inventories, and housing, and NX is net exports, or a country's total exports minus their total imports. If we increased any of these components, we automatically increase GDP by default. But what the government spends on can have massively different residual impacts on future GDP growth levels, which can be properly demonstrated with this simplified example. Imagine we build 2 roads. The first is between 2 major cities that increases trade and causes more production, which leads to wage growth over time. So GDP was increased in year 1 by the government spending on the road itself, but also every year after that as the cities and populations expanded and wages rose. The second road was built between BFE and nowhere, and no one wants to live in or travel to nowhere, so it goes unused. So while the initial government spending on these 2 roads was the same, and increased GDP by the exact same amount in year 1, Road 1 had residual positive impacts on our economy and production in future periods, so it will have a much greater impact on GDP over time. Okay, moving on. Now, all other things equal, if the government is spending on projects that have additional residual benefits, like infrastructure and innovation, we should see a healthy growing middle class, which is our second variable, and government spending to grow the middle class should be supported. And if our economy and our middle class are growing, we should see a declining rate of poverty, or at least a society where the barriers are diminishing that would prevent a child from escaping poverty should he or she have the misfortune of being born into that lower social economic class. And the ability to move between classes is an important attribute of a free society, because if that mobility isn't present, then we don't actually have a free society, we have a caste society. But if we have a growing economy, a thriving middle class, and declining barriers to poverty, we would expect wealth inequality to be declining, so that's our next variable to gauge government spending. Now, one thing that can expand wealth inequality and completely destroy a middle class is an inequitable tax code levied against them, which unfortunately is what we have, and let me demonstrate. Here are 2 couples that both make $117,150 in income in 2023. Couple 1 started a business and earned $117,150 in profit. After taking the standard deduction of $27,700 for married couples, the couple pays these federal taxes for an effective federal tax rate of 23.2%. Couple 2 receives $117,150 in dividends from stocks they inherited. And they don't work a single day during the year to increase our collective productivity. But after taking the same standard deduction as couple 1, they owe no federal Social Security taxes, no federal Medicare taxes, no federal income taxes, for an effective federal tax rate of 0%. And that's the difference between how our federal income and federal capital gains tax codes work, you just don't know it. Side note, if these kids born into poverty worked and earned a single dollar trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps out of poverty, they would have a positive tax bill due to the federal government. But if couple 2 inherited $25,840,000 from each set of parents, or $51,680,000 total in 2023, they wouldn't owe a single dollar of federal estate tax, because that's how our federal payroll and federal estate tax codes work. You just didn't know that either. So it's obvious that we don't have an equitable tax code, but we should for equally obvious reasons. So that's going to be our next variable to grade government spending. And if our government had achieved a society where real GDP was increasing, our middle class was healthy and growing, poverty barriers were diminishing, and wealth inequality was decreasing instead of being structured within our tax system, the government's tax revenues would be increasing, because effectively, that would be its reward or return on investment for achieving such a successful and ethical society, so that's our next variable. If the government is making prudent and intelligent financial decisions, the real growth of our economy will generate additional tax revenue for future endeavors. But if the government really wanted more money, it could just mint it. But eventually a system that leans too heavily on money creation without an offsetting economic production to absorb those newly created dollars will lead to higher inflation, so that's our next variable. Because we'd want to ensure that our government is appropriately balancing spending, transfers, and the gifting of lower tax rates and special itemized deductions to targeted groups of American citizens with our society's ability to grow and produce the underlying goods and services. So we would want to see acceptable or declining rates of inflation. Now, as the middle class is growing, poverty barriers are decreasing, wealth inequality is declining, we have an equitable tax code that is keeping inflation in check, and the government is appropriately investing its expanding revenues in projects with positive residual GDP impacts in future periods, it's highly probable that society's utility or our total collective happiness would be increasing because there'd be little to be upset about. So that's our next variable. But we won't be able to rely on our politicians to gauge this variable, because their answer will depend on whether their political party is in control. If they are, everything's perfect. If they're not, the sky is falling and the world is ending and you need to vote for them. So we're going to have to block out all that political bullshit when determining both societal utility and the last variable, the real value of our national debt. If our national debt is being accumulated in pursuit of these objectives, we're probably okay and society is functioning correctly. But if national debt is being accumulated for other reasons, we've probably lost our way and something needs to be fixed, which unfortunately is the conclusion I have come to after 4 years of intense research on this subject. Because the number one driver of national debt is not projects to drive these variables in the desired direction, it's from tax fraud, which I cover extensively in this 3-part tax gap series. And all that tax fraud is leading to more wealth inequality and reduced government revenues to cover expenses, which is generating higher levels of national debt for the wrong reasons. So after years of research on this topic, it turns out that it's not the amount of national debt that is our problem, it's the reason behind why it's growing so fast. But those are the variables to grade government spending, so let's look at a couple examples on how to use them now. If a politician talks about how inflation is hurting the middle class, while simultaneously recommending expanding tax deductions only used by a small portion of our wealthier citizens whose lives are not materially impacted by higher inflation, that politician is an asshole and needs to be replaced. If a politician advocates for increasing estate exemptions for dead Americans, but not standard deductions for working Americans, which would further reduce our equitable tax code, that politician is an asshole and needs to be replaced. And once you learn how to use these variables, you effectively learn how to pull back the curtain on our politicians. And you can't unlearn it and go back to being blissfully ignorant like I was before I started this project. Because the question becomes, why do the Democrats always criticize Republicans for passing tax cut acts that benefit the wealthy, but never undo them when they're in power? And why do the Republicans always criticize Democrats for reckless spending that we can't afford, but never materially undo it when they are in power? Are our politicians ignorant? Or are they just hypocrites? Or are they just assholes that need to be replaced? Or even worse, is this whole political struggle a ruse to give us the impression that we still have representation? I started this national debt project to prove my capabilities as a financial planner. I figured if I could solve the country's financial problems, you'd know that I could solve yours. It was a lot more complicated than I thought it would be, but I did it by reversing intergovernmental transfers and quantitative easing, and by structuring a tax code that reduced political influence over our economy. Which means the solution was to undo what politicians did and to block them from being able to be political hypocrites in the future. And that's not a good thing when that's the solution, which I'll explain in part 4 of this series. For now, I'm Stephen Pluger with WatchGuard Capital. Vote for me if I ever have to run for office, and use these variables to grade government spending.